the stage on this third Sunday in Easter. Jesus has been crucified on Friday. He remained dead on Saturday, and everyone thought that was that. The leaders of the people, the officials, the Romans, they thought that, there might be grave robbers, so they posted guards out in front of Jesus' tomb. And then the unthinkable happened. Jesus' body went missing. If we remember from last week, this to his followers would have meant that yes, he has risen from the dead, but more specifically, that he would have immediately ascended into heaven. He would no longer be on earth. Now, of course, this is a time when there weren't cell phones, there wasn't Facebook, there wasn't the internet. Everything happened by word of mouth. So when Jesus' tomb was discovered empty on Sunday morning, on what we now call Easter morning, by women who were there to treat the body, this would have taken a while for others to learn, to understand, to get the gossip. Not everyone quite yet is in the know. We begin this morning with Luke chapter 24, verse 13. Now on that same day is Easter. That same day is Sunday. That same day is the first day of the week, and only 3 days, or rather on the third day, 2 days, after Jesus was crucified. We know from Luke that 2 of them, as in 2 of his disciples, were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. 7 miles. That's an approximation made by the translation so that we can get an idea. No one exactly knows where Emmaus is. There have been several theories. Archaeologists have looked for it. Scholars have tried to place it. We know that at 7 miles, it would have been about 3 to 3.5 hours on foot away from Jerusalem. And given where we think Emmaus might have been placed in the geography, these 2 disciples would be walking west. They would be walking into the glaring sun. They would be walking away into the sunset. Now this, in our American culture, is rather a beautiful and romanticized view. We think of heroes in the classic Hollywood West, battling bad guys, and then riding off into the sunset. We've all grown up with this idea. However, it's not exactly the same in Luke. It's not exactly the same 2,000 years ago. To go into the West, as I said, meant that you were going into the sunset. But for Jews of this time period and for early Christians, these people wanted to go into the sunrise. They wanted to go into a new day, to go into the sunset. To walk west meant that you were looking backwards. It meant that you couldn't see what was in your future. It meant that you were preoccupied with the past, that you couldn't let go, that you were stagnant, that you were stuck. So here we have these 2 people, days after Jesus has been crucified, and they're not looking forward. They're looking back. They're going into the sunset, into a dying day. Now, what does this mean? Well, 2 things. Number 1, if you are walking into the sunset without glasses, without sunglasses, in the desert, in a desert culture, a desert land, you're probably going to be blinded. You can't really see what's going on around you. If you've ever truly walked into the sunset, and not necessarily in our New England homeland, where we have mountains and trees, but someplace flat, yes, with mountainous ranges, but where the sun would just take up the horizon, dazzle you. If you're walking into the sunset, if you're trying to see where you're putting your feet in front of yourself so you continue forward on your path, if you're looking ahead at your destination, you can't really see what's around you. If you have a companion, like these two disciples did, as there were two of them, if you looked over, you would see perhaps an outline of their face. They'd be in shadow. You wouldn't quite see them distinctly. Yes, you would know who that was. But if a third person joined you, if a stranger joined you, if someone who you thought was dead joined you and you are walking into the sunset, you would literally be blinded. Going back to the idea that to walk west, to walk looking into the fading sun, meant that you were stagnant, that you were looking at your path, that you couldn't move beyond that. Looking at that metaphor, we see it taking shape in verse 14. These two disciples were talking with each other about all these things that had happened. All these things that had happened. They're talking about the crucifixion. They're talking about the trauma of Jesus being put on trial. They're talking of the fear where they couldn't meet openly, where they couldn't say who they were, where they could be accused and damned by their fellow people just for being associated with their teacher. And yes, they're walking 7 miles. Whether it took them 2 hours or 4, they didn't have an iPod, their iPhone. They didn't have a radio, so they're gossiping. They're just, reliving it, parsing out the facts. Verse 15. While these two were talking and discussing, as I said, Jesus himself came near and went with them. Now we have an advantage. We know the story. We know the story of the road to Emmaus. We also know from 4 separate Gospels that were put into our Bible, 4 separate accounts, that Jesus is alive. Not only do we know that he is alive, but we know that he is revealing himself to his followers. But these 2 disciples, these 2 followers, don't know that. They don't expect it. They are physically blinded by the sun. When a third person comes up to them, it would never cross their mind that it could remotely be Jesus. This is something akin, I would say aliens coming to Earth, but we have sci-fi movies where that happens. This is something so extraordinary that even if they could see beyond the sun, even if they could physically recognize Jesus, their brain won't allow them to register it. Luke affirms that in verse 16, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. That is because they are walking physically into the sun. They cannot see him. That is because they are walking metaphorically into a sunset. They can't get beyond his death. They can't get beyond the fact that there are eyewitness accounts that Jesus was crucified and was not taken off of the cross until the Romans confirmed that he was dead. But it doesn't end there. In verse 17, and Jesus said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" These are friendly words, words of a stranger. You come up to a group of people, you're going the same way, you make small talk. Hey, what's going on? Hey, what you talking about? What's going on in your life right now? But But the two stood still, looking sad. And that stillness, that quietness, shows their grief. They are sad, but also they are shocked. Not 2 days earlier, Jesus was crucified. 2 other men, along with Jesus, were crucified. Less than a day before that, there was a massive trial. Everyone in and around Jerusalem would know this. So for this stranger, who happens to be Jesus, not to acknowledge this in his greeting or seem ignorant would just, they couldn't comprehend it. Everybody knows. Why wouldn't this man know? It's incomprehensible. Verse 18 is rather long. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He can't imagine it. This stranger, who's just a shadow in the sun, knows nothing of Palm Sunday, knows nothing of Judas's betrayal, knows nothing of Jesus being shamed in the streets and having to carry his own cross on which he is crucified, of not knowing of the death. As I said, incomprehensible. The stranger obviously didn't get the memo. He didn't get the 2,000-year-old version of a text message from all of his friends and their half-brothers telling him, "Can you believe what just happened?" And then Jesus says 2 words in response. He looks directly at one of his followers, seeing him for who he is, and allows him to explain. Jesus asks, "What things?" If you continue reading on through chapter 24, you see that Cleopas and his companion, 2 disciples of Christ, explain it to Jesus. And through their explanation, they suddenly see Jesus for who he is. They are no longer blinded. They are no longer walking directly into the sunset. They come to Emmaus, and there they stop. And there Jesus breaks bread with them. I think today's message for us in the 21st century is really short and simple. We are living in a time of undoubted change. Everything is in free-for-all, whether it's our finances, our health, or our liberty. And usually it's a combination, if not all 3. It's difficult. Sometimes, I don't know, I feel like I'm living in a dreamland because I can't think that this is actually happening outside of a science fiction movie that I've purchased a ticket to. I'm sure some other people have that opinion as well. That same dreamlike state might seem strange to you, but I like movies. We're suffering from a trauma as a society, as a planet. Something horrific began to happen months upon months ago, all the way around the world. Someone got sick, and then it continued, and it continued. And as airplanes flew out of different countries into new continents, the illness just seemed to spread. And soon after it, the panic began to spread. We are all suffering from trauma, however we have chosen to deal with it. But here's the thing. We just keep on looking back. We keep on placing blame, whether it's on our leaders, on our neighbors, on ourselves, on doctors, on anyone. We should have seen it sooner. We should have done something. Perhaps that's right. Perhaps it's not. We all have our separate and valid opinions. But as we go forward, whether we are well into this trauma or just a few short weeks out with a long road ahead, we can't keep looking into the sun as we head west and let ourselves be blinded. Let's not rehash what has happened in the past few weeks and the past few months. Yes, what has happened, our emotions, our actions should be analyzed, but we should move forward. We need to look at the bigger picture. Yes, this has happened, and yes, this is happening right now. But that does not mean that there is not a future. 2,000 years ago, two men were walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus. Their world had ended in a very different way, but it had ended nonetheless. The greatest teacher, the greatest rabbi who had ever lived, who they were privileged to know in some way, who they were privileged to follow. He had not only died, but he had been tried by their government and found guilty and was crucified before their entire nation. That is where, in many respects, you expect the story to end. The trauma has happened. Jesus is dead. The end. But no. For them, for these two men, for all of the disciples and followers, it was not the end. Their lives continued. Jesus was taken from the cross. He was buried. And then his body went missing. But still, as far as they knew, their lives were continuing on. They were walking that long road, trudging forward, one foot in front of the other. They didn't have a plan. They couldn't see what was beyond just getting to Emmaus, finding shelter, finding safety, being able to go inside and lock the door so that people couldn't come and drag them out and crucify them as well. They couldn't see beyond that short future. They were walking into the end as they knew it. They were walking into the sunset. They were dying again and again and again. But Jesus rose from the dead. And he came to these two men, and he walked beside them, and he spoke with them on their level. Yes, initially they did not recognize him, but still they spoke with him. Still he brought hope just by being there. He was the future. And so now, 2,000 years ago, while we are suffering our own trauma, we have to remember that we must look past it. Yes, we are trudging along the road, going about the motions, getting out our masks when we go to the grocery store, trying to make a day worth living, trying to make it all worth it so that we could get to the next step. But let's not remember that beyond this trauma, which will eventually end, there is another day. Let us not be blinded to the hope of a future. We will get there together through kindness, hope, and love. And let us remember that while we are trudging along this long, long road, that Jesus is walking beside us, that Jesus is speaking to us. If only we could recognize him. Amen.